We are back and we are joined now by Anna Bauer, senior editor at Lawfare, where she has been attending court hearings in the Kilmar Abrego Garcia deportation case. She's also covering a bunch of other legal battles involving the Trump administration. Anna, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case. Obviously, this has captured the country, I think, because it's putting a face and a family to the Trump deportation cruelty and the idea that this man is being sent to this El Salvador gulag, and you can see his wife. It's humanized this story where the administration has been relying on this notion that these people are criminals, and you can see obviously that that's not the case here. But you've been in court, you've seen the administration's arguments to the judge. I guess just as a legal writer and as someone with a legal background, what has been your perspective on how the Trump lawyers are arguing here?
Yeah, well, so first I'll just say on your previous comment about how this has really captured people's attention. I was at the courthouse yesterday for a hearing, and I've been a legal reporter for several years now. I've covered some of the most high-profile cases in the country. I covered all of the Trump criminal cases, was there every single day of the Trump trial in Manhattan. I have never seen a turnout to a court hearing as I did yesterday of the people who showed up in support of Abrego Garcia. It was really amazing. I was sitting in the jury room, which is where they kind of put us reporters to report on what's happening. There's a video and audio feed that comes through. And I could hear the entire time the just masses of people who were outside, who showed up to this courthouse. They were chanting, in support of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. So really, it has become, you're right, I think, this moment that has really captured people's attention and really has broken through in a news cycle that usually only will last a few minutes. This seems like the thing that has really captured people's attention. In terms of what I've been seeing, so, I know that you guys have talked about this case a little bit on the show, but just for a recap, this is a case that's about whether this guy, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Maryland man, a father of three, who was mistakenly sent to the gulag in El Salvador, whether he should be and can be returned to the United States. We had a ruling from the Supreme Court after a judge initially found, the executive branch does need to take steps to effectuate his return to the U.S. That then went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, we might quibble a little bit with the verb effectuate,
right?
But we at least think that there should be some effort to facilitate the return of this man, who the administration in court filings multiple times in sworn declarations has said that he was sent in error to this prison in El Salvador. The reason being that he had what's called a withholding of removal to El Salvador. So he could have been removed to other third countries, but he was prohibited from being removed to El Salvador specifically. And we can get into the background if you want on that, but that's kind of the gist of it. And then it goes back down to the district court after the Supreme Court says, at the very least, it was right of the judge to say that you should be required to facilitate his return. The judge changes her order to use that term facilitate, and then she calls in, this was last Friday, I believe it was, that she has the first hearing since the Supreme Court ruled. She brings the Justice Department in to ask them about, what is it that you've done to comply with this order to facilitate his return. They basically can't give her any answers. And keep in mind, the Supreme Court's own ruling said that the executive branch should be, prepared to provide what information it can. And she's asking very simple questions. What is his current custodial status and his location? What steps have you taken so far to facilitate his return? And then what steps will you take? And, again, over and over and over again, the Justice Department attorney said, I don't know, I don't know. So the judge ordered over the weekend that they had to respond with daily status updates to answer these questions, and that these status updates had to be from someone with personal knowledge. So someone who is, aware of what talks are going on, what actions are being done to try to bring him back. The Justice Department instead files these daily status reports late every day, doesn't answer the vast majority of the judge's questions. Basically, all they do is say, he's alive, he's in the custody of a foreign sovereign, and, we can't be compelled to forcibly remove someone from the custody of El Salvador. There was also, of course, while all of this is ongoing, a high-profile meeting between the president of El Salvador and Trump, in which they played hot potato. Pam Bondi saying, we don't have the power to get his return. The president of El Salvador saying, I don't have the power to return him. All of this is going on, and it leads up to this hearing yesterday, in which the judge brought the Justice Department in and the parties to try to figure out what to do about all of this, I think, because the Abrego Garcia's legal team has now requested what's known as discovery, so some kind of mechanism to get more information about what it is that the government is doing. And meanwhile, you've got a Justice Department that has filed some seemingly non-compliant filings, seems to be very defiant of the judge's order, and doesn't seem to be doing anything to comply with her order, even after the Supreme Court's very clear ruling. And it's really been remarkable as someone who, has covered so many legal happenings, to see the Justice Department acting in this way. And it's not just in this case, it's across many of these cases that I've been covering, in which they are really, if not outright being contemptuous, they are very much flirting with it and acting in ways that I think really you often assume good faith on behalf of officers of the court. But here it really seems like you just can't assume that anymore with this Justice Department. And so it has been quite a remarkable thing to cover, not only because it's captured people's attention in the way that it has, but also because, I think that we could very well be on our way to something that looks like a constitutional crisis and a standoff between the courts and the executive branch over this case.
That was a phenomenal recap of how we've gotten here. I want to back up to the beginning, or maybe not the beginning, but what the Supreme Court did by kind of parsing. Was it Paula Zenas who also was across the first case that said facilitate and effectuate? That was her ruling, right?
Yes. So Judge Zenas said effectuate his return, and then the Supreme Court said
just facilitate. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So why? So the Department of Justice and the Trump administration is now they're relying on what they assert is vagueness in the term facilitate, and they're trying to say that it doesn't mean what it says it means, or it just means we have to provide a plane. We don't have to compel the government of El Salvador to do anything. Is it your feeling that the Supreme Court watered down its ability to enforce its ruling by using that terminology? Or if basically the Supreme Court 9-0 had backed up what Zenas had said in the lower court, like, would they basically have come back with the same argument regardless?
Look, I think that to some extent, sometimes when the Supreme Court is trying to find a consensus, you might end up with a more vague terminology or a more vague ruling, and then they're going to leave it to the lower court, at least in the first instance, to work out. But and I will add too here that I think the difference between the effectuate, the concern that maybe at least some of the more conservative justices who place a lot of emphasis on the president's foreign policy powers, the concern they might have had about this term effectuate is that it potentially goes beyond the district court's powers. And they mention this when they say, this potentially exceeds authority, because it could be read as requiring the executive branch to make some sort of demand of El Salvador regarding Abrego Garcia's return. Now, keep in mind, we actually have reason to think that there is some sort of agreement here and that El Salvador may very well be acting as a contractor.
Exactly.
So it seems that it is in the executive branch's power to make such a demand. But,
has that evidence been presented by Abrego Garcia's lawyers?
So that has not been presented, but that is one of the hearing that was held yesterday, where the judge brought all the parties in to figure out next steps. Basically, now that there's been no evidence basically presented at all by the government that they've been doing anything to comply with this order to facilitate his return. The plaintiffs requested, like I mentioned, discovery on a variety of matters, including this potential contract or agreement that exists between El Salvador and the United States, because, of course, that goes to this question of who has the power to decide to bring him back. And is the government actually making, a good faith argument when it's saying, this is a matter of foreign policy, this is a matter of the sovereign authority of El Salvador. Well, if they have a contract that says that these are individuals who are being held on behalf of the United States, then that's a whole other thing entirely, because then it's not a question of, what does El Salvador want to do? It's a question of what the U.S. wants to do.
But what if they say, what if the government says this is foreign policy and we are not going to reveal based on because of national security our relationship with another foreign government, and that, has Zenas asked them to produce that evidence?
Yeah, so that's what I was getting to. So we got a discovery order. No, it's a good question. So we got a discovery order yesterday at the end of that hearing. Judge Zenas then followed up with a written discovery order as well. Over the next 2 weeks, the plaintiffs have the ability to send out, I believe it's a maximum of 15 requests for production of documents. So they may very well request the production of any sort of written agreement or, anything that relates to this agreement between El Salvador and the United States. They also have an opportunity to depose 4 individuals, including an ICE official, a State Department official, DHS official, who have all submitted some of these declarations that the government has been submitting, in which they basically say, we can't facilitate, all that we have to do to facilitate his return is remove domestic barriers to his return. That's kind of their argument there on that facilitate point. But and then also they get some interrogatories, which are written requests for information. And so the government will have to then raise objections to anything that they don't want to answer. They have alluded in some of these filings that they do potentially intend to claim that some of this information is classified as it relates to any arrangements that they have with El Salvador. Keep in mind, too, that in another case that is related to this, it's called JGG. That is the case that was before Judge Boasberg in the District of Columbia, and it related to the planes that were, taking off with people under the Alien Enemies Act. In that case, the government has tried to say that they can't reveal certain information because it's state secrets. That's another, privilege or immunity that they might raise to object to some of these requests for information. But that's all going to be happening over the next 2 weeks. which I know that a lot of people have been frustrated about the fact that this is, 2 more weeks in which Abrego Garcia is going to be sitting in a gulag in El Salvador. And meanwhile, it seems like this court process is playing out very slowly. But to that, I will add that 2 weeks in court time is really, really speedy. And so, it may very well be that we'll get some answers, or that the plaintiffs will get some answers on what exactly these arrangements are between El Salvador and the United States.
And is the Supreme Court, in your estimation, very wary about having its lack of enforcement power on display for the country? Because I agree with you that we are in full-blown, we're close to this constitutional crisis mode. I would say we're probably already there, but if the Supreme Court rules on this and builds off of its 9-0 ruling, and the Trump administration still does not comply, or they're stronger in their language the second time around, which we hope for, then this opens the door for broader, even more consequential ignoring of the Supreme Court by the administration. Now, is that your feeling about how the Supreme Court is operating here?
Well, look, I can't speak to what exactly is going on, because I just don't know in terms of what's happening in the minds of the justices. But I will say that maybe something that the Supreme Court might learn from this episode, in which you have people who are top White House officials going out and completely misrepresenting the order that was issued by the Supreme Court. You have, as I mentioned, the Justice Department kind of, twisting the words of the Supreme Court when it was very clear about certain things. But maybe something that the Supreme Court will learn from this is that if you're going to issue an order requiring the government to do something, you kind of have to really hold their hand like a toddler or something, and give them just like kindergarten level instructions. And you have to be very, very specific about what is required. And maybe there's an element here of, like I said, there's sometimes the Supreme Court might be vague because they needed to reach consensus, and that was the only way that they could, was by having using words that were a little bit more vague, not exactly specifying. Sometimes there's issues that they just think is more rightly left to let the district court work out. There's all kinds of reasons why they might have left things a little bit more vague, although I think it's pretty clear, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I do think too that one of the spillover effects here is that if the government is very clearly not complying with this Supreme Court order, then I think it makes it more likely that there's a kind of a spillover effect where in other cases, the Supreme Court, especially, and I'm thinking particularly the people who are at the center of the court, I mean, they're not center, but they are at the center of the court, John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett, might be less willing to, accept a cert petition and actually rule on the matter. They might just decline to hear the appeals in other cases, right? Because they want to, avoid this question of having a standoff. So I don't know. We'll see, but it's a good question. And certainly something that as people who cover this every day, we're watching for. And I think something that a lot of people are quite anxious about, because it's really unclear what will happen if we get to a point where there's outright intentional defiance of a Supreme Court order, and there's, as you mentioned, really no enforcement mechanism that the courts have.
Can you speak to, we have somebody, a viewer writing in, Blind Anti-Imperialism. Can you ask her why they keep repeating claims that he shot a cop? That's different than what we're hearing in court, right? I mean, there's a huge, I went through this yesterday, It's just a chasm between like what you're hearing from Stephen Miller and what you heard in that extremely disturbing press conference with Bukele in the Oval Office yesterday, and what they're claiming in court. Stephen Miller saying it's not a mistake, but the Trump lawyers have admitted that it was a mistake in court. Like they're also, as you said it earlier, they're not presenting evidence on time. They're playing around with the judge, and she seems to be very forceful in her frustration with the government's lawyers here. Like, what can you speak to that discrepancy and what you've observed in watching this case?
Yeah, look, so I'm not aware of where people that people are saying that he shot a cop. That has no basis in truth as
Right.
far as I am aware. But I can speak to Stephen Miller's claims that that Abrego Garcia was not mistakenly removed from the United States. He also said that claim arose from what he called a Democrat saboteur Justice Department lawyer who slipped that into a filing. That is an outright lie. The Justice Department lawyer, I believe that he was speaking about, is Erez Ruvini, who was one of the Justice Department, a career 15-year Justice Department official, has worked through many different administrations, argued at one of the hearings in the Abrego Garcia case. And, keep in mind, lawyers have a duty to be candid with a judge and to tell the truth. If you don't, then you can be disciplined by the bar. You can lose your bar card and your livelihood. And so during this hearing before Judge Zenas, she was asking questions about what the circumstances were surrounding Abrego Garcia's removal. And Rubini very honestly said, Your Honor, we admit that he was mistakenly removed. That was then included in filings when they went up to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to appeal. That was included in the Solicitor General's own brief before the Supreme Court. And all of that is based on a declaration from an ICE official, Robert Cerna, who himself said when Abrego Garcia was removed from the United States, it was an administrative error. ICE knew that he had a withholding of removal, that he could not have been removed to El Salvador, but it wasn't, on the flight manifest or that kind of thing, and it was a mistake. So for Stephen Miller to go out and say it wasn't a mistake is just, he knows that it is false. I don't see how he could not. I think that, Pam Bondi has since moderated her language to say something to the effect of, he was removed. There was there was still some additional paperwork that needed to be done. But I think that in itself
that's
is
due
an
process. That's you're admitting that you didn't give him the process that he was due.
Right. And one of the things that's really concerning, too, I will add, that they've been recently raising in some of these court filings is right before this hearing, when they filed one of the required daily status reports, they said that if Abrego Garcia shows up at a port of entry in the United States or at the embassy in El Salvador, that he would be taken into the custody of DHS, and then that they would redeport him to a third country or back to El Salvador after removing his order to prohibit his removal to El Salvador. And it's really unclear. The argument they seem to be making is that because they have designated the gang that the government has alleged that he's a part of, which there's really it's a very dubious claim. There seems to be very little evidence, if any at all, that Abrego Garcia was a member of MS-13. My colleague Roger Parloff has a great piece on this if folks are interested in that background regarding those allegations. But they've made this argument that because they've designated MS-13 as a terrorist organization, that somehow exempts a person from, being able to have a withholding of removal. And it seems that they're not even suggesting, like, as the Supreme Court said, having him go through the regular process where they would file a petition to, challenge that withholding of removal or something to that effect. It seems like they're just suggesting that there would be some kind of, pronouncement that he's no longer eligible for it, and then have him be removed again, which is really concerning because that is not how things work. There are processes that you go through in immigration court, and it just seems like they're really flirting with this idea that they can do whatever they want even if he is brought back.
Lastly, Anna, and then we'll let you go. What is the process for holding someone in the administration in contempt? Is it likely that the person that's held in contempt is not Donald Trump himself because of the Supreme Court's ruling on the president's authority and the not calling his actions illegal, basically, while he's in power? I mean, what is your sense of how that could happen?
Yeah, so look, it's. I think that we have a long way to go before we get to contempt. Although Judge Zenas, in her order yesterday, did say that she was one reason why she's ordering discovery or a kind of investigation and production of documents and all that. One reason that she's ordering that is because she wants to understand if contempt proceedings are needed. The plaintiffs in the case have asked her for an order, what's called an order to show cause, that why the defendant should not be held in contempt. One of the problems here, though, and we've seen this in some other cases, I mentioned the Judge Boasberg case, which at one point it seemed like we were headed towards contempt proceedings in that case. But one of the issues here is exactly what you have asked about, which is the question of who do you hold in contempt? Because you kind of got to find out, is it who is the decider? Who is the person who all of this non-compliance is kind of emanating from? And the first stage of that is going to be this discovery process that I mentioned. One of the issues, though, is that the people that they are going to depose, that the judge has ordered be deposed, are these people who have filed declarations in these daily status updates. And if you look really closely at the language in those daily status updates, these are people who, even though they're claiming to have personal knowledge, they're saying things like, as I understand it, or as relayed to me. So they're really kind of, it seems to not really be people that have personal knowledge about what is going on. And so even when they are brought in for questioning and when the plaintiffs are deposing them under oath, I think one of the things that they're going to be trying to ascertain is who are the real people with knowledge, who are the real decision makers here. And then, as you go up and try to find that chain of who potentially would be the person to be held in contempt, it may very well get harder because of invocations of privilege and those kinds of things. So I think that we're at the very beginning stages of this. I mean, I would highly doubt that we're going to see the Supreme Court holding the president in contempt. But at some point, too, keep in mind that, it gets to a point where it's not just the people who are in the executive branch who are making decisions about how to facilitate removal themselves who are in contempt, but may very well become the case that some of these Justice Department attorneys may be the people who are acting in a contemptuous way because of refusals to provide information, because of this consistent pattern of conduct. So, and the judge has seemed to be quite frustrated with the fact that some of these attorneys are not getting information from the client. But regardless, all of that said, I think that it's a long way to go before we get to contempt. And I think that, you've already mentioned before, and I'll mention it again. It may very, very well be that even if you get to finding contempt against anyone in the executive branch, in the Justice Department, there may not really be an enforcement mechanism, because it's kind of like, if it's civil contempt, it's, fines. It's until you're trying to get to compel some kind of action that they're not doing anyway. And you can't exactly throw someone in jail when the jails are run by the federal government, right?
Yeah.
So it's complicated.
It's complicated, and I appreciate you laying it all out for us. This is part of why we're supposed to have 3 branches of government, and the legislature is not doing its job, which is what, the courts are not equipped for this, even in the best of circumstances when we didn't have a right-wing Supreme Court. This is the problem of what the legislature has become, but that's a conversation for another day. I won't keep you too much longer. Everyone should check out, if you're interested in this case, Lawfare is doing live streams and covering, recounting your coverage of this case and others on the Lawfare site. So people should go check that out. Anna, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.